MMOs are bigger, flashier, and more accessible than ever before. But I don't think I'm alone when I say that something fundamental is missing from the experience. Sure, the modern heavy hitters are fun. They're easy to get into. No struggling to figure out where to go, what to do, how to do it. It's all there and it just works. But over time, I find the modern MMO experience just gets boring. Classes often feel like reskins of each other. Boss fights boil down to memorizing slightly different patterns, and it never feels like you're really making any choices, which is a fundamental part of game design. So while I do have some fun playing modern titles like Final Fantasy XIV, I and many other players yearn for something a little more. I want more depth, complexity, and freedom to craft my own playstyle. This is something I feel older MMOs nailed, albeit to a bit of an extreme degree and at a severe cost. Many people express similar sentiments, with other creators on this platform also complaining about the state of the genre in general. But I think I found one game that gives us an example of what a modern MMO could truly be. So join me as we take a deep dive into the evolution of MMOs over the last 20 to 30 years, and discover how ATLYSS recaptures what modern MMOs have lost. ATLYSS is a modern online RPG developed by Recaptures. I say modern because it's a pretty new game, but seeks to capture a very 2000s era aesthetic with its artistic style. It's not really an MMO, but it tries to deliver a bite-sized MMO experience. The game was initially released as a series of demos on itch.io in 2021, with an early access release hitting Steam in November of 2024. In it, you'll create a furry character selected from one of 5 races: Imp, Poon, Chang, Kobold, and Bertle, with the ability to customize their colors, features, and, assets. Anyway, once you create your character, you'll be greeted with all the features you'd expect from an MMORPG. Hotbars, skills, magic, questing, partying, NPCs. It's all here. Unlike a typical MMO that houses up to millions of players across many servers, ATLYSS is played on a tiny player-created server, with anywhere between 2 and 20 people at a time. As you start playing, you discover the world of ATLYSS has been struck by a catastrophe known as the Shattering that has corrupted much of the world, and it's up to you and your adventuring friends to restore the world back to its former glory. You don't know much about yourself yet, outside of the fact that you're a lost soul that's been called to the Sanctum, the main player hub, by Angela. It's heavily implied that we're reincarnated or in some kind of purgatory, but the truth remains to be seen. Anyway, that's all pretty good. It sounds like we have a really solid foundation for a standard MMO experience. UI, combat system, questing, simple story, and most importantly, other players. As I played the game, I realized something novel. I was having more fun with this bite-sized, not an MMO than I've had with nearly every modern hotbar-based MMO I've tried over the years. ATLYSS is engaging and keeps me coming back for more. I feel in control of my character and how I want to play it, and the content has just enough variety that even repeat runs of the same dungeon are freshened up a little bit each time. So what gives? Why do I feel this way? And why might some other people also feel this way? Well, we could immediately start picking apart ATLYSS's systems and design to find out why, but I think it's more important to get a solid background of what modern MMOs are, how they started, and how they got to where they are now. Alright, MMORPG. MMORPG is defined as an online role-playing video game in which a very large number of people participate simultaneously. The term was coined by Richard Garriott in 1997 to describe Ultimate Online. MMORPGs grew out of MUDs and earlier social games. I actually covered this in some detail in my last video on Frecadia and how it laid out the foundations for modern virtual worlds like VRChat. If you haven't seen that video, definitely check it out. In this video, we're going to be talking about the old style of MMO design, the new style of MMO design, and the space in between. However, I don't want this to just be about old versus new, because there's a little more nuance to it. It's not that the genre evolved over time into what it is now. It's more like the entire design philosophy has changed down to the fundamental level as the years went on. MMOs today are nothing like MMOs of the 90s and the 2000s, and I attribute this to two distinct design philosophies: world-first design and player-first design. Each have their own pros and cons, but I'm of the mind that leaning too much into either direction will lose you the attention of most players. This is because each design philosophy makes a certain demand of how much time, attention, skill, and reward are involved with the game. They also differ in complexity of systems and immersion, so let's unpack them. Starting with world-first design, this is what most old-school MMOs like EverQuest, Classic WoW, and Final Fantasy XI are like. In this form of design, developers focus first on creating a living, breathing, believable world, and then filling it with NPCs, environmental challenges, enemies to fight, cities, villages, and camps. Immersion is the goal, with some older games going deep into the lore, politics, geography, and cultures that exist within that world. Those of you who particularly love World of Warcraft Classic probably understand what I'm talking about here. These games focused on longevity of content as opposed to constant expansion packs and patch cycles. They had long grinds and wide learning curves that were instrumental in making what content was available last as long as possible. Content was repeatable, but difficult and variable, often with rare, high-tier gear and items as the ultimate reward. These games are often characterized by their long progression into a very difficult endgame to serve as the ultimate test for players and their character builds. Character builds are, of course, a fundamental design of these games, but are a remnant of the earlier single-player and tabletop RPGs that inspired MMOs in the first place. Victories were meant to feel earned after many attempts and failures. Drop rates for the best items were low, motivating players to repeat content in order to get their preferred drops. This had the underlying side effect of constantly ensuring that there were enough players willing to do the content so that new emerging players could also get a chance to experience it. Partying up was a critical component of these games, as you could hardly do anything on your own. Players needed to work together. In the game design world, we call this player interdependence, and it was a necessity in ensuring active and healthy MMO communities. There are many benefits to this kind of design. The first is what I stated earlier: longevity of content. The longer it takes for people to clear content and get everything they want out of it, the longer players will be engaging with said content. This gives developers plenty of time to work on bug fixes, updates, new additions, and even entire expansion packs. Putting focus onto a very demanding and optional endgame meant that players weren't left behind when the new content came out. In terms of the player experience, this style of design gave die-hard RPG fans something to really sink their teeth into. Systems were incredibly complex and multifaceted, encouraging experimentation and discovery. Classes were also very complex, each having their own identity and purpose in a party. Instead of the single-role trinity system that we have today, classes in earlier MMOs were designed to fit into a number of roles for a party, being particularly suited for some roles and only minimally or moderately suited for others. This gave the game a huge potential for strategic diversity, allowing players to work together to build their own solutions to challenges in order to achieve their gameplay goals. This has the side effect of fostering a very strong, tight-knit community. Players who play well together will want to keep playing together, and it's that sense of unity, commitment, and the thrill of success and synergy that keeps players coming back. Of course, this design philosophy comes with a few caveats. Firstly, these games are insanely intimidating to new players. They're not straightforward with telling you where to go, what to do, or how you can do it. And some people really enjoy that, but a majority of new players to your game are going to be intimidated right out of the gate. Players without a strong desire for self-exploration and discovery will feel overwhelmed and drop the game early. Others may pick up on it, but conclude that the dedication requirements for success are simply not worth it for them. The high demands, in some cases, may even create a high-tension community where players who cannot perform to the highest level are ousted by the hardcore players, leaving casual players alienated and treated as second-class players. Elitism is a huge problem in any game, and some might argue that this design style actually encourages elitist behavior. Even if it only happens in small pockets of players, with most players being very helpful and patient, all it takes is a single, really bad experience being posted on Reddit or other platforms to turn would-be players away from a game. These games were beloved by their fans, and still are today. WoW Classic is still beloved by old and new players alike. Final Fantasy XI has shown remarkable longevity with a recent uptick in new players, and dedicated communities still house private servers for the games that have collapsed into mainstream obscurity. Now let's take a look at player-first design. This design philosophy is all about crafting the player experience first, fleshing out your combat system, character creation and customization, and an engaging story. These games put players into a cinematic, more on-rails experience with a focus on high-intensity individual experiences. These games are also designed with the player's time in mind, with a strong emphasis on making it possible for a player to do just about everything the game has to offer, provided they have the time to do it. Systems are much simpler than their world-first counterparts, and demand less of a time investment in order to accomplish gameplay goals. This is the promise of first-world design: the freedom to do anything and everything the world has to offer. A play session feels fulfilling not because you spent a lot of time doing a single task that was difficult, but because you were able to accomplish a lot in a short burst of playtime. This style of design also produced something interesting: an emphasis on story in MMOs. Now don't get me wrong, old MMOs had stories, and they were pretty good, but they were more vague and open-ended, and attempting to not conflict with the idea that there were hundreds of thousands of other players running around doing the same things as you were. But player-first design MMOs like modern WoW and Final Fantasy XIV put the player in an epic, cinematic narrative with incredible graphics, voice acting, and action. These epic, large-scale cinematic experiences are breathtaking and very memorable for players, sticking with them long after they've cleared the content. Player-first design came with the introduction of things like the Trinity system and matchmaking, almost entirely eliminating player interdependence. In older games, devs relied on the connections players made by working together and crafting their own strategies to solve problems. In this newer style, there's not a lot of potential for that, so the devs rely on a thrilling and engaging story, filled with high-octane solo-player experiences for players to have memorable moments. This puts MMOs on the same kind of playing field as the narrative-rich single-player RPGs that inspired them. This design philosophy has seen major success over the years, with WoW and Final Fantasy XIV becoming the two heavyweight champions of the MMO scene and staying that way for well over a decade. This design philosophy propelled MMOs into the mainstream, achieving mass appeal to casual and hardcore audiences alike, albeit for slightly different reasons. Casual players engage in clearing daily content, customizing their character, crafting, role-playing, and even just casual socializing. Your more hardcore audience dedicates each patch cycle to clearing the hardest content on the current patch, and optimizing the speed in which it's done. Of course, even this approach comes with trade-offs. No design philosophy is perfect. On the surface, it might seem like player-first design has won out in the court of public opinion. I mean, the fact I gave it the name Player First is already a pretty good sign, right? All games should put their players first. While it is true that these games have an improved game-to-life balance and are more accessible, there are some caveats here. Firstly, the systems in these games are incredibly streamlined compared to their older counterparts. By attempting to make players able to do everything, everything ends up feeling stale. Crafting soon becomes monotonous and repetitive, classes start feeling the same, and the lack of strategic diversity means that there isn't any meaningful choices a player or a party can make during a fight. And the lack of player interdependence means that people aren't connecting or engaging during their play sessions. By making the system simpler and accessible, their longevity and depth have been reduced, leading to a generally shallow experience over time. Things get stale, and in a genre that attracts people looking for a forever game, that becomes a problem. We've seen the problems with streamlining RPGs and other game franchises like Fallout and The Elder Scrolls, despite their mainstream appeal, and there are many videos covering this issue with those particular games. In MMOs, catering too much to player convenience often means fast content cycles, which can burn out developers and lead to more superficial feeling content over time. We're starting to see this with Final Fantasy XIV, with producer Yoshida even stating that it's time to re-examine the game's combat system. Elitism is still a problem that exists in these games too. Since the character building, classes, and progression systems are so streamlined, the challenging content often comes in the form of mechanical skill checks, often called mechanics, where players must position themselves strategically around the battlefield to avoid attacks that could instantly or nearly instantly incapacitate them. This requires players to balance between optimizing their DPS output and avoiding damage. For endgame or high-tier content, players who cannot quickly adapt to the grueling mechanical demands of these fights are ousted by the hardcore players, and even when able to meet the mechanical skills required, players will often be lambasted if they fail to meet optimal DPS parses. This causes a sharp divide between the high-tier players and the casual players. On a final note, and I think this is the most important one, Player-First Design attempted to learn from the limitations of past MMOs by making their games more solo-friendly. But this is a double-edged sword. It's great that a player can complete the game largely on their own, with optimized matchmaking filling the gaps when other players are indeed required. However, this does present a challenge when playing with friends. In Final Fantasy XIV's case, the story often introduced the player to solo duties, partially cinematic battle content in which the player must complete a series of objectives usually centered around defeating enemies. They do this alone, and there's no way for party members to join them. A particular problem this creates is the inability for friends to complete the game together. So I'm going to get personal for just a second here. Despite my critiques of the game, of which I have many, I still adore Final Fantasy XIV, and I know most of my friends will enjoy it, so I often encourage them to try it. However, because of how the MSQ progression works, it's not feasible for me to accompany them on their adventure and clear content with them outside of waiting for them to reach a match-made duty and then party up with them. My friends aren't really interested in playing alone. They want to play with me because I got them into it. And it becomes a struggle for them to complete the game when I can't do anything with them, especially through the game's most critical and high-impact moments. This level of accessibility is great, and lets players complete the game on their own time without the need for other players. But it also denies them the opportunity to experience the incredible emotional heights this game offers with the people who matter most to them. On a personal level, that's one of my greatest disappointments with 14 in particular, and for me is the antithesis to the goal of a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. Anyway, that's enough getting personal. I just wanted to put that out there. There's still some things to note here from a design perspective. Again, Player-First Design has seen incredible success. These games are the MMOs of our time, and beloved by millions and millions of players, and while they have their problems, I believe those problems are easy enough to address over time as player preference evolves. Player-First Design has taken the genre of MMO from a niche hardcore gaming experience catered to only the most dedicated of players and propelled them into the modern zeitgeist of gaming society. That simply can't be ignored, but with the rise of players demanding more from these games in the form of class identity, more choices, more freedom over player builds, what is the solution? Well, I believe we might have been given an early look into what a hybrid model might look like in the form of ATLYSS. With all that design context in mind, let's really start to unpack ATLYSS, its systems, and its design, and how it balances the two design approaches we discussed earlier. Let's start with character creation. When you load up the game for the first time and create a character, a default preset will be loaded for you. From here you can select from one of the 5 races I mentioned at the start of this video. Each race has 2 forms, a masculine and a feminine version. Next, you'll be able to modify a number of parameters on your character, including color, size, proportions, and your starting weapon. There's no class selection here. Everyone starts as a base class called Novice. Keep this in mind because we'll be talking about this later. You'll also have a starting number of skill points that you can invest into strength, mind, dexterity, and vitality. More on these later. Once you've spent 5 hours creating your perfect furry short stack, that's it. That's it. The game's over. You did it. Good job. You spawn into an area called the Sanctum, and that's really it. There's no clear direction on what you need to do outside of some very basic level design cues. So I guess it's time to explore the Sanctum. Approach the large structure in the center and you'll be greeted with a large world portal and... Dear God. She's perfect. Talk to Angela. She'll give you a quest to find other NPCs and discover the main objects you'll be interacting with to get around. This introduces you to the game's questing system and makes the player familiar with all the progression mechanics they'll be using on their journey. So we go to the item shop for the quest objective and... I would die for you. Sally acts as the item shop in the game. Her inventory starts out very basic, but as you level up and progress, the items she has on offer will improve. Finally, make your way around to the barracks and you'll meet Enoch. Oh dear god damn, look at that. Enoch will have some quests for you as well. By now you should have noticed a theme between all the characters though. Angela is aligned with magic, Sally is aligned with looting and thievery, and Enoch with just pure raw power. Keep this in mind. Once we talk to all the NPCs and have a nice collection of starter quests, we'll make ourselves familiar with the world portal and the gateway that takes us out of Sanctum. We're ready to start our adventure. Let's take a moment to look at the game's UI. It's fairly basic and what you'd largely expect from any MMO experience. The bottom of the screen houses your hotbar, which contains all of your abilities corresponding with the number on your keyboard. To the top left, we have a bare-bones minimap that shows you the basic structure of the map and any players or NPCs in the area. Finally, we have the quest log, which shows you your currently active quests in the top right portion of the screen. An interesting thing to note about the hotbar is that you can actually have two and swap between them using the Q key on your keyboard. Keep this in mind as well for when we start talking about player choice and strategic diversity. To the bottom left, we have some basic inventory information, including cash on hand, and a secondary hotbar aligned with the function keys that can be used to quick use an item of your choice. Branching off from the hotbar to the left and right is a simple yet unintrusive health and mana bar, respectively. Come to think of it, this kind of reminds me of Diablo 2. Oh boy, is that a trip down memory lane. Next to the minimap, we have an indicator for the current time of day, as this world has a day and night cycle. Finally, there's a couple of sub-menus that are brought up with the K, L, O, I, and P keys. K loads the skills menu, where skill points obtained by leveling up can be invested into unlocking both race-specific and class-specific skills to add to your hotbar. Some skills have to be found in the world in order to use. The L key brings up your full quest log, showing you all active quests, their descriptions, and an option to abandon them. I opens the inventory system. There are 3 different inventories: equipment, consumable, and trade items. O brings up the server menu. P opens up the stats menu. This is where you can invest any stat points you've acquired by leveling up. Despite classes mostly benefiting from a single stat, you are free to invest your stat points as you see fit. A side menu to the right shows you exactly how your stats affect the more obscure in-game stats like damage, defense, etc. Venturing out into the first area outside of Sanctum, we engage in the quintessential newbie MMO pastime: killing slimes. Reminds me of my Ragnarok days. Combat is straightforward. You attack with the left mouse button, perform basic movement with WASD, and block or parry with the right mouse button. You can also use the items or abilities on your hotbars with the corresponding keys. One of the key mechanics you'll want to master quickly is parrying. This is done by timing your block with a certain time window of an enemy's attack animation. Parrying can be difficult, but incredibly rewarding as it will stun lock the enemy for a period of time. Get a perfect rhythm going, and you can keep the enemy basically permanently stunned. This not only makes parrying a flashy playstyle choice, but a source of damage mitigation. The challenge comes when you're surrounded by multiple enemies and have to pay attention to all of their attack animations. Sometimes you'll inevitably find that it's the best decision to just run away instead of trying to parry every attack being lobbed at you. Movement in this game is snappy and allows for jumping and double jumping for evasive maneuvers. Using the E key while moving, your character will dash in the direction it's facing. Use this to get yourself out of sticky situations and reposition yourself back into the fight. From here, we have all the things we need to get started with leveling up and getting stronger for the journey ahead. After completing our first couple of quests, we'll get introduced to our first dungeon, the Catacombs. You likely start this somewhere around level 6, and you can do it alone, but it's going to be much more manageable if you're able to play with friends. Entering the Catacombs for the first time, you'll be greeted with a maze-like dungeon setup with a series of rooms connected by hallways. These instant dungeons are semi-procedurally generated, so they're a little different every time you load them up. Inside the dungeons themselves, of course, there will be smashable containers that drop items. Item drops are interesting in this game because it's not a server-side pool of items that spawn. Everyone gets the loot that drops, and the loot tables are pulled from the client side, meaning everyone can get different drops. So while I might smash a container and get just a few coins, someone else might find a piece of gear from that same container. Despite the potential for exploitation, I like this idea a lot because it does away with the need for lot casting and internal squabbles over loot. Rooms will also have monster spawners, which when triggered will seal the room until all waves of enemies are defeated. Some rooms may also contain puzzles or platforming challenges that need to be completed in order to progress. The low-level version of Catacombs, levels 6 to 12, doesn't actually have a raid boss. Instead, a simple teleporter will appear indicating the dungeon has been cleared. Oh, right, I should mention that each dungeon has 3 tiers of difficulty based on level range. For the Catacombs, tiers 2 and 3 will include a boss fight. Bosses in this game serve a classic MMO purpose: rare loot drops. When you fight the Catacombs boss, he'll spawn a treasure chest upon being defeated, which will drop usually 1 random piece of rare gear for a specific class. The boss itself will also drop a badge, which can be traded to an NPC near the dungeon entrance for specific drops in the event that you've cleared the dungeon several times and haven't gotten the items for your class. This is a very nice system. I sort of detest how modern MMOs just feed you a currency for doing content for you to trade for the item that you want. I still like the thrill of random drops, but this is a nice touch for when that thrill wears off and I just want to get the item I've been working so hard for. Upon reaching level 10, you'll be able to choose a class. This is done by speaking to one of the 3 starter NPCs in Sanctum. Angela will give you the Mystic class, a magic user that specs largely into the mind stat to maximize efficacy of spells. Sally will give you the Bandit class, which specializes in dexterity. They're quick and nimble and deal modest amounts of damage very quickly. Finally, Enoch grants you Fighter, a class focusing on raw strength and dealing devastating blows to enemies. These classes seem simple on the surface, but there's actually a surprising amount of depth in what you can do with them. First, let's talk about weapons. Each class has access to a couple of basic weapons, but no class is excluded from a weapon type. Each weapon in the game has a single specific stat that its damage scales with. Katars and bows scale with dexterity, swords and two-handed weapons scale with strength, and scepters and bells scale with mind. But that's not the be-all end-all to weapon scaling. There's another starter NPC that we weren't required to talk to that lives in a unique building in Sanctum: Vivian. Vivian enchants weapons to apply certain stat bonuses onto them, but she also has a secondary function: changing the stat a certain weapon scales from. This has endless possibilities. My particular favorite is playing a mystic with a scythe that scales off of mind. This means that you're not classed out of a weapon or playstyle. This, combined with a variety of skills that are most useful in different situations, offers class and playstyle customization that we simply do not see in modern MMORPGs, and I am all for it. There is one caveat, however. Modern MMOs have really shifted in the direction of making leveling all classes, or at least many classes, a somewhat reasonable endeavor for players, allowing them to dip their toes into a little bit of everything until they find the class that's perfect for them. ATLYSS does not allow you to do this. Once you select your class, that character is stuck with it. There's no going back. You can respec your stats and skills using some items that Sally offers, but you can never change your actual class. This incentivizes players to make alt characters to try new classes, and that's something we don't really see too often in MMOs. Most games are designed in a way where you'll only ever need one character, and incentivizing or rewarding players for making alternate characters is something I've always wanted to see developers experiment with. Whew, okay, so I think that was everything to get started. That was a lot to take in, so thanks for sticking with me throughout all that info dumping. But there's more. Now that we know these mechanics and design choices, let's see how they fit into the world-first and player-first design aspects. First off, let's talk about world design. ATLYSS features a relatively sprawling world that looks gorgeous despite going for a deliberately dated-looking art style. There's a distinct sense of culture, unique architecture, and visual narrative taking place that offers a somewhat surprising level of immersion. Navigating the world feels somewhat natural, and I say somewhat because the world relies a lot on teleporters to move players between different areas. This is probably because a big challenge with the world and level design, especially in MMOs, is creating areas that are both game-sensical and world-sensical. It's difficult to create carefully curated player experiences on several maps and then connect those maps in ways that look and feel believable and immersive. Teleporters being a solution in a world that's already exposed you to an abundance of magic from the moment you enter is a solid design choice in my opinion. Now, do I think that ATLYSS was designed as world first? Actually, no, but I do think it shares a lot in common with world first design, in that the content was crafted to fit with the world, not the other way around. Each NPC in Sanctum is not just in a shop or a vendor hole, but in a believable place that they even interact with. Angela tends to the books, Sally sweeps the floor, and Enoch, well, just kinda stands there menacingly as a giant hulking behemoth, which, kinda makes sense considering where he is. The world has been filled with lush vegetation and NPCs going about their day. It's minimalist, but it feels real enough. Every zone and area you navigate and explore shares consistency with the chosen art style, while also introducing their own unique aesthetics and presentation. The only thing I'll say that isn't world first are the instanced dungeons. They do feel like they are a product of game design rather than world design, but I think this is an important balance. In this case, the playability and enjoyability of the content was put as first priority. I think that's important when you're trying to get people to enjoy playing your content, especially when you expect a player to repeatedly play it. Overall, the world is unique, immersive, and believable enough to capture a player's attention and spark that initial excitement for exploration that's common in many world-first games, while also providing content to players in a player-first experience to ensure longevity and enjoyability of the repeatable content. Next, let's take a look at class design. Once you reach level 10 and choose your proper class, there's a number of options you have in how you want to play that class. First off, there's skill prioritization. While you will no doubt end up with all skills from a class, you can't always fit all of them on your hotbar, and the race-specific skills that you start with and additional skills you can find and learn on your adventures, you kinda have a system in which players must choose what they value most for their preferred playstyle. This means that you can have two players playing the same class but in profoundly different ways. A mystic could decide to spec into straight magic damage, healing and utility, or both. Add weapon stat scaling modifications and you have a level of freedom in building a class tailored to your playstyle that we really only find in world-first older MMOs, where ATLYSS gives them a player-first sort of facelift in its simplicity of use. Skills are not too complicated. The tooltips are relatively short. Icons do a pretty good job of telling the player what that skill is on their hotbar. You're not necessarily spamming a rotation of the same abilities, but it's easy to identify a situation where you might want to use a particular skill between your normal manual attacks. This mirrors the simplicity and just works feel of a player-first modern MMO. The end result is a system where the player has a certain level of freedom and experimentation that feels good to use and doesn't require an associate's level worth of knowledge to master, all without sacrificing class identity. A term we hear a lot in MMO speak is encounter design, which seems to be an offshoot of enemy design. Encounter design usually refers to the big boss battles like raid bosses, and enemy design will refer to your run-of-the-mill enemies or trash mobs. Enemy design is all important. It provides the main challenge for your player to overcome. There are many ways to go about enemy design, but it all comes down to how a developer leverages the systems of their engine to present a combat situation to the player. This can be done with a focus on strategy, making the player learn how enemy types and damage types work in the game and testing their ability to leverage them in a strategic capacity by using the kit available to them. Another way is skill checking, introducing a set of physical game mechanics to a player and designing the enemy in such a way that puts their mastery of these physical mechanics to the test via jumping, maneuvering, or parrying. Of course, there's no reason you couldn't take an approach that combines these two. Older MMOs usually focused on the former, requiring players to understand damage types and weaknesses and then leverage them against their enemies. This involves taking the time to learn the affinities and associations of every enemy in the game, and choosing the correct abilities and weapons to use to defeat them. Newer MMOs tend to go with a more skill-based approach, freeing up a lot of mental agency for the player in exchange for a test of reaction time or tactical arena mastery. ATLYSS combines both of these. There are damage types in ATLYSS: elemental damage, weapon type damage, physical versus magical damage, and damage from debuffs. One all-important aspect of game design is fairness, and specifically perceived fairness. When players are introduced to the rules of how a game or game world operates, they expect those rules to be universal and apply to all entities in the game. That means if the player can be poisoned, they expect most enemies in the game to also be able to be poisoned. Developers can get away with some flexibility in this, accounting for the flow of major boss fights and other exceptions such as elemental or type resistances. ATLYSS manages to balance this out. What can happen to the player can also happen to most enemies. This promotes consistency and hastens the rate in which your players will understand the rules and machinations of how your world works. Enemies in ATLYSS can universally be parried, and that's a very important aspect to combat when the game spent so much of its early time trying to push the mechanic onto you. Enemies are also designed with unique animations that telegraph when an attack will be processed to assess for hit and damage. To top it all off, encounter design sticks with this consistency. Even bosses can be parried, even if they aren't necessarily stunned as a result. While the bosses and mini-bosses in the game have their own very, unique abilities. Bosses are usually built upon basic enemies, reusing their mechanics but to a more extreme degree to amplify the danger. The reason I'm focusing on this particular aspect so heavily is because I think it's very important that your encounter design leverages what the player has already learned about how the world works. It's very frustrating to go into a boss fight only to find none of the old rules applied before, and that there's a special new mode the player has to fall into in order to win the boss fight. Traditionally in games, basic enemies serve as a gate in order to intuitively teach the player a set of mechanics or strategies that can then be applied to bosses. The basic enemies are the studying material, while the boss is the final exam. You run the risk of completely alienating your players and breaking your game's immersion if the encounter design completely tosses out everything you've been trying to teach the player. I believe ATLYSS takes a solid and balanced approach to this, introducing bosses in a way that is consistent with what the player has already learned, while also equipping those bosses with unique and devastating abilities that add to the danger and stakes of the fight, making the player truly feel like they're fighting a boss, without completely flipping everything they've learned on its head. A defining feature of any MMO is player interdependence. To put it simply, this is when a game is designed so that, eventually, a player cannot progress on their own. They'll need the skills, strengths, and resources of other players in order to overcome challenges. For world-first MMOs, this is at the core of the experience. Enemies get so strong that it's no longer feasible to fight them solo. EXP was usually capped, so it became prudent to decrease time to kill to maximize experience per hour. Boss battles? They were especially group-dependent. As strategies developed, some classes became extremely coveted for their unique skills. If you played Red Mage in Final Fantasy XI back in the old days, you'd constantly get bombarded with people asking you to join their party so you could be a refresh and dispel machine. Player-first games still incorporate player interdependence, but not in such extreme ways. Player-first MMOs, specifically World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, introduced the Trinity system, which sought to simplify classes into a few distinct roles: tank, healer, and DPS or damage dealer. Players naturally filled these roles before, so this merely streamlined the process. Additionally, the introduction of matchmaking severely cut the time it takes to find party members to clear content with, but the idea stayed the same. Most content still required a party built from these roles. In both examples, the games are designed in such a way where trust, reputation, and cooperation are essential components to achieving gameplay goals. ATLYSS doesn't have a trinity or a matchmaking system, preferring to instead incorporate an older style of party formation by having players directly engage with and ask one another to group up. In older games, this came with a few problems. The first being that it took a long time to find or construct a party, especially if party leaders were particularly picky about team composition. The second problem ties into the first. Progress halted immediately if you couldn't find a group. So if someone can't get a party to recruit them, or a forming party can't find enough players within the right roles, they're out of luck. ATLYSS revives this older style, but with one distinction. The content can be cleared solo. It might take you longer. You might die quite a bit. You might even have to overlevel. But the design decision to make death, especially in dungeons, amount to little more than inconvenience means that players are not outright punished. It just means spending more time to overlevel a little bit before doing a piece of content. The important fact is that players have an option. Spend the time to find other players to play with, or spend that time progressing more slowly. This means that a player's progress isn't immediately halted if they happen to be online during inactive hours. Older MMO fans love this approach because direct interaction and long party sessions create real opportunity for bonding. That's why you hear older MMO players talk so nostalgically about their adventures. The bonds they made were substantial. Some argue modern streamlining killed the opportunities for these social bonds, leaving today's MMOs feeling emptier. ATLYSS, again, strikes a balance, preserving this most sacred of MMO experiences. To wrap up this incredibly long section, we need to discuss friction. Friction, from a game design perspective, is any element in a game that is designed to slow the player down, create a barrier, or provide a challenge. If I were to pick one single thing that modern MMOs lack in today's world, I would say it's friction. Mainstream MMOs attempt to make their very large games as non-intimidating as possible for their players so as to not scare them away. This is why they're easy to pick up, easy to learn, and easy to execute. The streamlined simplicity of modern MMOs is a tactical design choice to make the game as appealing to as many players as possible in order to preserve concurrent players paying for the game and to maximize revenue. On paper, this sounds like a great idea, but as we already figured out, players will eventually get bored of your game unless you're constantly pumping out new content with new rewards, which isn't always sustainable. This is why they can often feel like a content or cosmetic treadmill. They want to add new content to keep you engaged, but they also need to keep a squeeze on the difficulty and challenge so as to not lose players. Older MMOs had a lot of friction, long grinds, difficult fights with incredibly complex battle systems, and long, drawn-out quests with high travel time between areas. In attempting to learn from the mistakes of old design philosophies, modern games have overcorrected, and that's why I feel these games feel like they're lacking soul. Once again, I feel like ATLYSS delivers a balance, and I want to look at a few common elements of friction used in MMOs and how ATLYSS masterfully incorporates them without intimidating players too harshly. One thing you'll notice right away upon playing an old MMO is this. The world is dangerous. Dying is incredibly easy, and comes with a pretty harsh consequence, mostly revolving around lost time. If you're traveling somewhere on foot for a long journey and suddenly die to enemy aggro or an environmental hazard, it will often take you a very long time to make up that lost ground. While this is frustrating, it's also interesting. It provides a challenge to the very passive act of moving your character. Players need to be on the constant lookout for potential threats, and have contingencies in place in the event of encountering one. While the old way of doing this is extreme, ATLYSS doesn't completely eliminate it. The world is filled with numerous fiends who will attack you on sight and chase you throughout the map, though they're easy to outrun in most circumstances if you plan on covering enough ground. Your choices are to run or fight, but since many enemies give experience and drop loot that can be sold or used for enchantments, deciding to run might be a less profitable venture. Additionally, the world is littered with various traps and hazards that can severely harm the player, meaning you'll want to stock up on potions before entering a dungeon or setting out for a long journey. This makes running between quest targets more interesting, instead of reducing them down to mere fetch quests. Players will have an easier time navigating the world by understanding enemy types and how much of a threat they are, as well as committing areas of the world to memory to avoid traps and hazards. This makes the world feel alive and real, offering both engagement and immersion. Next up is something called mechanical commitment. This is described as a game's input systems or combat mechanics and the measure of weight they have in the experience. An extreme example of this are Souls-like games, where inputs are often queued and cannot be cancelled, punishing players who engage in button mashing instead of carefully planning out their actions and movements with deliberation. This is done to give actions meaning. If you start channeling a spell, you either cannot stop or will be interrupted if you attempt to do something else. This example makes sense and provides meaning to spellcasting. Since magic is powerful, it takes an extraordinary amount of focus in order to use it, which is actually a form of affordance, but we're not going to talk about that particular game design term in this video. Newer MMOs streamline the experience by limiting mechanical commitment as much as possible without allowing the player to completely break the flow of combat, usually through GCDs or global cooldowns. Older MMOs depended on casting or channeling times. In other words, modern games want you to feel powerful. Older games want you to feel responsible. Mechanical commitment is how they did that. In the case of ATLYSS, mechanical commitment is minimal, but present. A player can choose to use the attack input multiple times manually, or simply hold it down to continuously launch a flurry of attacks in a given direction. Where mechanical commitment makes the most impact here is parrying. Using the block button will give your character a Smash Brothers-like shield that will block some incoming damage. Timing your blocks perfectly negates all damage and stuns the enemy, rewarding patience and observation. Commitment also exists in mechanics such as double jumping or dashing, since you can only double jump one time and you can only dash or blink one time. This makes combat in ATLYSS feel both deliberate and fluid. But here's the funny thing about friction. When you describe it to a player, they'll usually recoil. Nobody says, "Oh yes, please make my game harder on me. I would like that very much." But the truth is, friction is where the fun lives. If you're a particularly skilled designer, friction becomes your most important asset in creating an experience that is engaging and immersive, but also fun. Most of the fun of games comes from the friction. The rules we agree to play by, the limitations of actions we can perform, and the decisions that other entities in a game will make. Without these, games just aren't fun. With too much, they're frustrating, and with too little, we get bored quickly. ATLYSS's level of friction combined with its difficulty makes for a truly balanced experience that is just engaging and immersive enough to keep players hooked for several hours. I think it's safe to say that I love ATLYSS. The reason I made this video is because as I've played modern MMOs, I kept feeling like something was missing compared to the games I grew up with. For the longest time, I thought it was just nostalgia, longing for a simpler era, but ATLYSS kinda proved me wrong here. For the first time in years, I felt that spark again. Diving into systems, building characters around unique playstyles, chasing rare drops in dungeons, and making new friends to adventure with. And on top of all of that, ATLYSS has this beautiful world that Kisev has brought to life, a world crafted with clear passion and care. Yes, the game is still in development, and a lot will change over time, but I'm genuinely impressed by what one developer has already achieved. It's something special, and I'm incredibly excited to see where the journey goes from here. If you haven't tried ATLYSS yet, I really recommend giving it a shot. It's absolutely worth the price, and it's being shaped by a developer who clearly wants to make something memorable for all kinds of players. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, I also made a video on one of the earliest MMOs, Forcadia, and you can check that out here. And if you want to hang out with me live, I also stream on Twitch. Come on by, say hi, meet the chat. Until next time, please take care of yourselves. And don't forget I love you. Bye for now.